As a project manager, how can you best use procurement and contracts to successfully deliver a project? How do you find subcontractors at the best possible price and then manage them effectively? Whether you like it or not, procurement and contracts are critical to project success. Between 70 to 90% of the cost of any typical project are outsourced to suppliers and subcontractors. Potentially 90 cents out of every dollar you spend is going to external vendors. If there's one process you need to get right to manage your project successfully, it's procurement and contract management. So in this video, we're going to go step by step through the procurement and contract management process. The focus is going to be completely on how you leverage and utilize procurement and contracts to more successfully deliver a construction project. Okay, so what is the procurement process? Well, it comes down to 4 key steps. You've got planning procurement, so setting up the procurement process for success, preparing your tender packages, procuring your vendors and subcontractors and choosing the right ones, then managing these vendors and suppliers to ensure they complete the scope correctly as we want it. So step number 1 is planning procurement. So what do we mean by planning procurement? So planning procurement means setting up the procurement process for success. We need to establish the processes. So what are the steps we're going to follow to manage procurement? We need to work out what we need to procure. So we need to create a work breakdown structure for each package, go through a make or buy decision. Decide whether it's more effective to self-perform the works or outsource it to an external party. And we need to work out when we need to procure all these things. We need to create a procurement schedule. So first off, we want to establish the procurement process. So the procurement process is captured in a document called a procurement management plan. So a procurement management plan can be an informal thing on a small project, but on larger projects, you'll always have some sort of procurement management plan. The procurement management plan defines how we're going to manage procurement on the project. So it's talking about defining the process. What are the steps we're going to follow? What are the key inputs to the process? Any template documents, so template tender packages, scopes of works, pricing schedules, determining our limits of authority. So whether we need management to sign off on packages above a certain level or whether we have approval to do it. And then also how we're going to monitor and control the procurement process. How do we check we're staying on track, things aren't slipping behind? So once we've established the process, we know how we're going to do procurement. The next question we need to answer is, what are we going to procure? What do we need to buy from the market? We need to create a shopping list. So we want to do this by creating a work breakdown structure, decomposing the project scope into pieces, and then for each of these pieces of the project scope, work out whether we can perform it ourselves or whether we need to procure a subcontractor to do it for us. Okay, so what is a work breakdown structure? So a work breakdown structure is a deliverable-orientated decomposition of the project scope. So we take the project scope and we break it down by trade. So we could break it down for a bridge into earthwork, structures, or services. We can break it down geographically by areas. We could have zone 1, zone 2, zone 3, or we could break it down by phase. And these are multi-layered breakdowns. So you could use all these different ways to decompose the project scope. So let's imagine a road project where we've got our work breakdown structure level 1. We've broken down the project by trades. So we've got earthworks, structures and bridges, utilities and roadworks. And below this, we've again broken it down by trade. So we have for the earthworks, we've got clearing and grubbing, bulk earthworks, drainage and subgrade. And we've done this for all the different packages. We've then done this again. So under utilities, we had street lighting, and within street lighting, we've broken it down into the pits, conduits, and foundations. So the civil component of it, installing the poles, the distribution boards, and then the cabling and the light fitting. So the circuits and the luminaires. We can then create our full work package dictionary. So this is where we go through each of the components and list out every single minor package of work. So that becomes our work breakdown structure dictionary. And the output is we'll have a full register of every single activity we need to do to complete the project. So for pits, conduits, and foundations, we've then broken it down into zone A, B, C, D. And we've done this for all the different activities. Distribution boards, we've broken down by the number of different distribution boards. So you can see how clearly we can see the exact scope of the project with this full work breakdown structure dictionary. We know every single little thing we need to do to complete the project. So the next question is how can we deliver or how can we best deliver each package of work? So we know all the work we need to do. The next question is how do we deliver it? So we can get a subcontractor to do it for us. So pay another company to deliver the scope. We can self-perform it. So managing it using our own internal resources, or we could come up with some sort of hybrid option. So how do all these different options vary? Well, on one end of the spectrum, we've got our what requires the most supervision and management from us, but it's the lowest cost and the most risk, which is self-performing the works, managing it all ourselves, buying all the materials, plant, equipment, and not transferring anything to a third party. On the other end of the spectrum, we've got what requires the least supervision, but will pay the highest cost, but also has the least risk. So this is completely getting a subcontractor to everything for us. And we've got our options in between. For example, we could free issue materials to a subcontractor. We could engage them on a schedule of rates where we take the risk for the volume or quantity of work, or we could engage a subcontractor on a wet hire rate. So there's all these different hybrid options we can come up in between them. And important to note is any specific subcontract, you could have different portions of the scope broken down different ways. So how do we make the decision on the best model to choose for any package of works? Well, it comes down to several different factors, and we need to consider all of these to make the best for project decision. Number one is safety. Do we have the skills and expertise to manage it ourselves, or do we need to engage a specialist contractor? The cost, is it going to be a lot cheaper to self-perform than it is to subcontract? Is it worth the additional risk and management needed? Quality, again, do we have the skills and expertise, or is it a specialist trade? For example, if we're not an electrical company, we shouldn't be self-performing electrical works. We're going to end up with a whole lot of defects and quality issues. The program, what sort of time do we have? Self-performing works generally works better if you have a long time to do the work and a smooth, continuous flow of work. If you have a ton of work you need to do in a short period of time and it stops and starts, better off subcontracting. What is the experience of our project team and our organization? Again, for a company that specializes in earthworks, we would be subcontracting electrical works. If we're an electrical company, we'd probably be subcontracting earthworks. So it comes down to the organization, the project team experience. The last one is an important factor to consider, which is market conditions. Now, we can only pay a subcontractor to do something if they're willing to do it, and they'll charge us what they can do it for. If we're operating in a market where there's 20 subcontractors all willing to offer us competitive pricing and we can fully leverage the market competition, we're going to get a much better deal. However, if there's no subcontractors willing to do it, it's silly to get lump sum pricing because we're going to get overcharged for the work. So we need to consider the market. So what does an output of the make or buy decision look like? Well, it's basically for each package of works, we know exactly how we're going to deliver it. So for the pits, conduits, and foundations, as an example, we'll self-perform those. For the light poles, we'll procure the light poles ourselves, but then get our electrical subcontractor to install them. For distribution boards, we'll procure them ourselves and get our electrical subcontractor to install them. And for the circuits and luminaires, we're going to get the subcontractor to supply and install everything. So we've taken the street lighting scope, we've broken it down into different packages of works. And because we know how we're delivering each package of works, we've pretty much created ourselves a shopping list. We know what we need to procure from the market. So for example, for the self-performed civil works, we need to get the labor, the plant, and the materials. We need to also buy the light poles and the distribution boards, and then we need to find an electrical subcontractor to do the installation. The next thing we need to do is we need to determine when. When do we need to buy these things to meet our schedule? So the procurement schedule is the document we create to capture this information. It's a list of all the packages we need to procure from the market, when they're required on site, the point in time when we're able to start the procurement, and the time frame for the procurement process. So the procurement schedule is the document we use to capture all the procurement activities and when they're going to occur. The goal of the procurement schedule is to ensure that procurement is completed in accordance with the overall project scope. This fundamentally means that for each of the packages, they're available on site when we need them to meet the project schedule. Okay, so the procurement schedule, the structure of it's really basic. It's all the different tender packages, everything we need to buy from the market, and then just the steps in the procurement process. So across the top, I've got prepare tender documentation, review the tender package, tender release date, the date we're going to close the tender review, so a time frame that we can use to assess quotes, then award a contract, and then what date the works are going to commence. For example, the supply of the poles, we have a date we want to have prepared the tender document, we've got a period to review it and check it's correct. We then have a date we issue it to the market. There's a date the tender will close, so we're giving them 1 week to price the project. Then we've got a week to review the quotes. Then we have a date we're going to award the supply contract. And then we've allowed 12 weeks for the lead time of the poles, which gives us a ready on-site date. So a date the poles will be on-site. The goal is we want to take the date the poles are required on-site from the master project schedule and make sure we have enough time available to complete all these different activities. So the procurement time frame is going to have 2 key factors driving it. The early start date, the earliest we can begin procurement. This is going to be driven by when we have enough information to complete the procurement, which is the design. So for example, to order our poles, we need a quantity of poles and a drawing that shows us what pole types we need. Then we can begin the procurement. There's also a late finish date. What's the latest date we need the goods and services on site? So this is going to come from the project schedule, which will tell us when we need to start installing poles. So when we're doing the procurement schedule, we want to make sure that the early start date, when we've got the information available to begin procurement, gives us enough time to get the materials on site by the late finish date. So when we've finished planning procurement, we've got a process to follow. We've got the procurement management plan. We know what we need to procure. We have a shopping list that we can take to the market, and then we know when we need to complete the procurement. We've checked the date. We're going to have enough information available, and that there's enough time to allow for all the different procurement activities so the goods and services are on site when we need them. So once we've planned procurement, the next step is to begin preparing tender packages. So a tender package is a set of documents we issue to potential subcontractors that describes exactly what we want them to do. The metric I use to check if a tender package is sufficient is, does it give the subcontractor enough information to price the project? It needs to accurately define what we want, because this is the set of documents that will form the basis of the contract. So what does a tender package contain? It will contain instructions and invitation to tender form, design, drawings, and specifications, key documents like the scope of works, pricing schedule, and any relevant management plans like a safety management plan, and a draft form of the contract. So the invitation to tender form, it's a document that summarizes the tender process and provides instructions to the supplier on how to prepare and submit their quote. So it covers the overall tender process, how to lodge tenders, key contacts, the tender documentation attached, the returnables that they need to provide. So what information do they need to provide to describe their quote, the duration they have to quote the project, the evaluation criteria we're going to use to assess their quote, and how to ask questions or issue addendums. Next, we've got the attachments we provide as part of the tender process. And the most important of these by far is the scope of works. The scope of works defines in detail exactly what we want a subcontractor to do. If they're doing bulk earthworks, are they doing the clearing and grubbing? Are they supplying the material? Scope of works has to define all this in excruciating detail so the subcontractor knows exactly what's expected of them and exactly what to include in their quote. The primary objective of the scope of works is to allocate responsibilities. So what we mean by this is to make it clear who is responsible for what. This is both scope, so the work they need to complete, and also risk. So what uncertainty are they required to manage? Any scope of works should include a project background, so a broad overview of the project, general scope and requirements, specific scope, which references the drawings and details exactly what they're doing, and any relevant attachments such as drawings, specifications, quality standards. Say, for example, we're procuring an in situ concrete package of works. So the tender scope of works will determine the size of the slabs, the number of slabs, the finish on the slabs, the curing method, the methodology. Do they need a pump to access, or can they pour it directly out of an adgie? The staging of the work, so indicative schedule milestones, quality requirements. Are they responsible for concrete testing, or are we? And any exclusions. For example, are they going to do the excavation for the slabs? Are they responsible for the service penetrations, or are we doing all that? I'll attach an example scope of works to the course notes so you can review it and look at it yourself. But it's basically the thing you want to think about. You just need to outline everything a subcontractor has to do so if they can take it and they can accurately quote the job. It needs to have enough information for this. The next attachment we want to provide is a pricing schedule. So a pricing schedule is a breakdown of the project scope to map the specific scope activities to line items in the quote. Basically helps us to understand the supplier's quote, manage payment claims, and manage variations. So when we're talking about how to set up a pricing schedule, you can have different types of pricing for different activities. So for example, you could have a lump sum for a certain activity. So no mapping of a price versus a quantity, just a fixed lump sum for an activity. You can have a quantity-based item. So whether it's a fixed price per unit, or you could just have day rates. So these are just hourly or day rates for labor and plant. Okay, so let's see an example pricing schedule. So we've got lump sum items for the preliminaries, which is mobilization to site and induction of plant and personnel. They're just giving us a lump sum item. Then we've got the contract work item. So we've given unit quantities against all the different activities. So installing pits and conduits and foundations, we've given a quantity of 60 meters. For the streetlight foundations, we've got 14 foundations. And we've also got a day rate section. So this is where we're just getting lump sum quantities per hour, per day, per unit of materials for different activities we potentially would require the contractor to do as variations. Now, in addition to defining the scope we want the subcontractor to do and how we want them to break down their quote and fill up a pricing schedule, we also want to give them a program. So we want to clearly define the subcontractor's responsibility to finish the works on time and also how they need to stage the works. The components of a program is we want to give them contract milestones, responsibilities to maintain a program, and any schedule reporting requirements, resourcing, working hours, and responsibilities to attend coordination meetings. So these are the sort of requirements we want to define when we're talking about program. So there's a lot of different ways you can include a program in a scope of works. Now, the way I like to do it, rather than giving them the whole project schedule and just leaving them to do a lot of interpretation and research. And because schedules also always change, I like to just give key milestones in the schedule. So just a small table with the key milestones for their scope of works and an anticipated completion date, the duration, and also the shift type. So when you're working on projects which have day and night shift, it's important to specify the type of shift they'll be doing because that'll impact their labor rate. So the easiest way I think to do a program is just to give them the key milestones they need to meet so they can understand the staging and management of the works. Another useful thing to include in any scope of works is requirements for inspection and testing, or the quality requirements. Now, these are just the standards to be met and the documentation to be submitted for any construction activity. Specified in the scope of works. And another key thing to do is to make sure it's clearly linked to payment milestones. For example, you can specify in the scope of works that you'll withhold 10% of a payment claim pending the final quality assurance and testing. It just sets a precedence for when you're managing the contract, the subcontractor is completing all their final closeout and QA. Additionally, we want to include the drawings and specifications that define what we're building. Projects almost always contain a ton of different design documents, so it's critical we include the right ones. We should include the relevant design packages for their scope of works, the status of the drawings. We want to make sure that we've got the IFC drawings, or if we're completing the procurement for IFC, that we're including the most up-to-date drawings, technical specifications, any schedules and references to any key general notes that will impact their work and their pricing. There's always this question of which drawings and specifications should you include in the tender package, and to me, it's a balancing act. If you have too little information, there'll be design information missing that could be excluded from a subcontractor's quote, and you leave yourself open to variation. If you give too much information, say you give them 1,000 drawings for a tiny package of works, they're just going to exclude any reference to the drawings and they're not going to be bothered going through them because it's going to be a waste of time. So again, you're going to end up with the same problem that they haven't based their quote on the drawings. To me, if you don't understand what drawings are relevant exactly to the subcontractor's scope and what important general notes that reference and impact their pricing, you don't understand the works well enough to be getting quotes for it. So you need to really understand yourself what drawings, specifications are relevant to their scope, and then clearly reference and take the relevant drawings for their work. The drawings you want to include in a table and a reference at the back of the scope of works or the contract. So a simple table with all the drawings listed and any relevant specifications. In some instances, we may be procuring design scope from the contractor. So the package of works we're procuring might be a detailed design and construct package. In this case, this would be referred to as shop drawings or fabrication drawings. This is particularly when you have a subcontractor providing some sort of proprietary product that's not directly specified in our design or we're requiring on their technical expertise. So far, we've spoken about the scope of works, the pricing, schedule, the program, all the key things that define how the subcontractor is going to complete the works. Another important attachment to any tender package will be the form of contract. So the terms and conditions we're going to use to govern the arrangement with the contractor. We want to select the correct form of agreement and include it in the tender package so that they read and understand the terms and conditions and they negotiate any specific terms that can impact their price. For example, we might have some huge rate in there for liquidated damages that if we don't tell the subcontractor about when they're quoting the works, they won't have factored that into their price and they'll change it later. So there's a ton of different contract forms we can choose from. And then within each of these contract forms, there'll be specific terms and conditions we can adjust. So we could have a subcontract agreement, a minor works agreement, supply only agreements, simple purchase order, plant hire agreements, labor hire agreements, services or ongoing service agreements. And when we're getting design scope, professional services agreements. Company we work for will typically have template documents for all these. And if they don't, there's typically international standard forms that cover these key contract forms. Each of these forms of contract will cover the project schedule and time requirements, performance requirements, payment terms and conditions, defects, security, so whether they provide bank guarantees or retention, how to deal with variations, and how to deal with disputes. So the terms and conditions are broken down into these sorts of sections and they talk about how to manage all of these different situations. Once we've prepared our tender package, we've got our scope of works, our schedule, we've defined time requirements, we've got a set of documents together that define exactly what we want the subcontractor to do. The next step is to procure. We'll issue the tender package to the qualified subcontractors and suppliers. We need to manage the tender process, so communicate with them, keep records. The vendor will then prepare a methodology and a quote to submit to us. Then we need to assess the offers and undertake a gap analysis to determine an accurate quote from each subcontractor. So once we issue a tender, a subcontractor will first review it and begin preparing a quote and methodology. If they've got any questions, they'll send us an RFI or a request for information from which we may need to update the tender documentation. So this is referred to as a tender addendum. Well, then during this process, we should have tender meetings. So some sort of meeting with the subcontractor to review the documentation and also undertake a site walkthrough, so an inspection of the site to identify any latent conditions or issues they might have. Once we've received the quotes from our subcontractors, we then need to assess the offers and award a contract. So we want to do a comprehensive assessment of the quotes we've received. So we want it to be multi-dimensional. We want to choose the best value for money subcontractor for the project, which means we need to consider everything. Not only that cost, but the schedule, the safety requirements, how capable they are to do the work. We want to consider all relevant criteria and capture this in a tender evaluation form where we score their offers. Importantly, we want to review the documentation they've provided and see if they've excluded anything from their quote. If they've excluded anything from their quote, we need to adjust their quote or ask them to reprice it to include it. So we're comparing apples to apples. We also want to undertake a pre-award interview, a meeting with our subcontractor, again, to go through the documentation, to ensure they've included everything, to ensure they understand exactly what we want. Then, once we've negotiated the terms and conditions of the contract, we can sign a contract. The key point to note here is that the cheapest doesn't equal the best. The goal of the assessment is to find the best value for money subcontractor. The subcontractor who can do the project, meets our requirements, is going to do it safely, effectively, to the right quality standards, and offers us the best possible price. We do this by completing a comprehensive tender evaluation form and checking the offers for completeness and any exclusions, resolving them with a gap analysis. The biggest mistake I see people making during procurement is issuing a tender package, getting quotes, the subcontractor attaches a letter of offer, and they've excluded a whole lot of items. So when they compare quotes from different vendors, they're not comparing apples to apples. So any tender we receive, we want to check for completeness to make sure it meets our minimum requirements. Have all the returnables been completed? Have the documents been filled out? And what are the departures and exclusions, and how can we resolve these? So when we're assessing a subcontractor's quote, we want to consider the cost, so the quote they provided, the technical offer, so whether they're technically capable of completing the work, their proposed methodology, and whether it fits within our project requirements, whether they've reviewed the contract and don't have any significant departures, whether their safety standards, whether they're capable of doing the work safely, whether they've assessed the program and complete the works during our required timeframes, any risks or uncertainty that they'll introduce or haven't taken responsibility for things we want them to, and also whether they've got the capabilities to do the work to our quality standards. We capture this assessment in a tender evaluation form. So every single one of these factors, technical, safety, cost, we score the subcontractor. So basically, against each of the subcontractors, we get a multi-criteria decision and an overall score to ensure we've got some objective way of assessing the best quote. So when subcontractors have departures or exclusions from their quote, we have to do a gap analysis. So there's two different ways we can resolve a gap in an offer. We can ask the subcontractor to reprice it and to include in our scope, or we can set money aside for variation. Or if all the subcontractors have excluded a certain thing we've asked for, we need to find an alternative way to deliver that package of work. So that might be to include it in another package or to self-perform it. But we need to resolve any gaps at this point in time to make sure we're not going to be hit with costly variations later on. We're going to have missed scope that's going to delay our works. Once all of these things are resolved, we've chosen the best value for money subcontractor, we've negotiated the terms and conditions of the contract, we can sign and award the contract. So this is going to require some internal approvals from our company, which might be done through a limit of authority. If it's a big package of works, it might have to be signed off by a general manager. If it's a smaller package of works, it might just be signed off by a project manager. We've resolved the commercial departures, we sign physical copies. The subcontractor provides us either bank guarantees if they're providing bank guarantees, and then we can begin the work. So we've gone through the entire procurement process. We've now signed a contractor and we have a subcontractor ready to begin works. Our subcontractors now ready to begin works. Now our job is to ensure we get what we're paying for. We need to manage our subcontractor. So the final part of the construction procurement management process is contract administration. The worst possible thing we can do at this point in time is let and forget. Contract administration is about ensuring that both parties do what they said they were going to do. We need to ensure the subcontractor performs the work as promises, and we need to administer the contract. Even though we've transferred the responsibility to perform the works onto a subcontractor, there's no guaranteeing they're going to do a good job. There's no guarantee they're going to do what we ask them for. So the worst possible thing we can do is that now we've signed a contract, forget about the works and just assume the subcontractor is going to do what they said we were going to do. We want to manage the subcontractor to make sure they're doing what they said they were going to do. So in terms of any construction contract where there's a buyer and a seller, there's specific responsibilities that each party has to do to ensure the works occur smoother. For us, the head contractor, we need to pay the subcontractor for the work they've completed, give them access to site and review and approve any claims. The subcontractor needs to complete the works, maintain their security and insurances as specified in the contract, develop and maintain a program that shows they're going to finish as they said they would, and then they're going to be able to claim any entitlements for variations. Contract administration occurs in 3 stages. So there's the startup phase, which is post the contract award, where we have pre-construction planning meetings and organize and plan the works. Then construction, where the subcontractor completes the works, and then closeout, where we close out the contract and finish our responsibilities to one another. When we're administering the contract, there's a couple of different components to this. There's scope, so making sure they do what they said they're going to do, the physical completion of the works. There's time, making sure they're doing the work on time, following and maintaining a program. There's managing any design responsibilities, so that's both coordinating the design that we've completed, issuing them the correct drawings and managing any RFIs they have, but also where the subcontractor has shop drawings or detailed design scope, we're managing their design and checking it's done correctly, managing both payment claims and variations, paying them for the work they've completed and assessing their progress payments, managing their quality, ensuring they're doing their inspection and testing and managing any witness and holding points, and then safety, so making sure they're doing the work safely and appropriately managing risk. Okay, so in terms of contract startup, always hold a kickoff meeting where you have an initial planning meeting and go through the scope of works. The subcontractor should submit their key paperwork they'll need to do the work. So their inspection and testing, their proposed construction program, any safety documentation, and if they're doing design, any design or shop drawings. The subcontractor will also need to do their procurement. So if they need to order materials, they'll do this now. And the head contractor is us. We need to ensure everything is in place for them to complete the work. For example, if we're free issuing them scaffold access to an area, we would check that the scaffolding's in place and ready for when they come to site. The subcontractor then delivers the work. So they develop a program. Now they have to stick to it. They have to do the work as planned and report on progress to us. We want to have regular weekly meetings to go through progress, address issues as they required. We want to stay ahead of them to ensure they've always got access and they can smoothly complete the works. And we want to monitor and control to make sure they're doing their quality documentation, they're sticking to their schedule, and most importantly, they're doing the work safely. The subcontractor will then complete the construction works. We want to do a proper handover to ensure they've completed the works correctly, do joint inspection and punch listing, rectify any defects. Then once they've fully completed the work, submitting their quality documentation, everything's done correctly, we've checked it, they've closed out their punch list items, they can submit a final payment claim and we can close out the contract, return their security and begin the defects liability period. Okay, so through this, we've gone from an idea for a package of works, an item in our work breakdown structure. We've worked out how best to deliver it. We've identified what we need to procure. We've ensured we've completed the procurement on time. We've created a tender package, got quotes, done the best value for money subcontractor, negotiated and awarded a contract. They then completed their construction works. We've planned, delivered, and closed it out, and we've finished the work. So that's the entire procurement and contract management lifecycle. As I said in the beginning, external project costs to vendors and suppliers can be 90 cents out of every dollar we spend. So we need to make sure we're effectively managing procurement and contracts. We do this by planning properly, preparing tender packages that define exactly what we want, managing the tenders effectively, assessing and awarding the contract to the best value for money subcontractor, then effectively administrating the contract. Procurement is one of the biggest sources of cost, but it's also one of the easiest ways to save money. And that's why companies care so much about construction managers who can effectively manage procurement and contracts.